Good morning. My name is Brianna, and today I'm going to be reading Little House in the Big Woods to you. We're going to read the first chapter. This book is brought to you by HarperCollins Publishers, and I'm reading it to you because they've been very kind and allowed people to read without violating their copyright through December 31st, 2021. I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along with me. Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Chapter 1, Little House in the Big Woods. Here we have a drawing of this little girl in the red dress. Her name is Laura, and she's the main character in our story. The little girl in the blue dress is her sister Mary. The man and the woman behind her are her mother and father, and she calls them Ma and Pa. Need to plug in my mouse right quick. Once upon a time, 60 years ago, a little girl lived in the big woods of Wisconsin in a little gray house made out of logs. The great dark trees of the big woods stood all around the house, and beyond them were other trees, and beyond them were more trees. As far as a man could go to the north in one day, or in a week, or in a whole month, there was nothing but woods. There were no houses, there were no roads, there were no people. There were only trees and the wild animals who made their homes among them. I'm going to pause right here and tell you something about the story. So this book was published in 1932. That is a very, very long time ago. That is almost 90 years ago. And so this book is talking about a time 60 years before that. 60 plus 90 is like 6 plus 9, which is 15. So this is actually telling us a story about this little girl's life 150 years ago. Now, that would have been in the 1870s, in the 19th century. Now, there's nobody alive today who was alive back then, but my great-grandmother, we call her Nanny Cheatwood, she was born in 1927. And so if you do the math, Laura, who's the little girl who this book is about, could have been my nanny's grandmother. So you can kind of imagine Laura, when she's a grandmother, telling my nanny this story about her life growing up as a little girl. Even though it was such a long time ago, this story is about a little girl who's 7 or 8 years old, kind of the same age y'all might be. And that was the age I was when my mommy first read me this story. She used to read me a chapter each night before I went to sleep. And her mommy read her the same story too when she was a little girl. So I'm very excited that I get to share it with all of you. We're going to jump back into our story now. You can follow my mouse along on the screen if you want to read along with me. We're starting with the word wolves. Wolves lived in the big woods, and bears and huge wildcats. Muskrats and mink and otter lived by the streams. Foxes had dens in the hills, and deer roamed everywhere because deer have antlers. To the east of the little log house and to the west, there were miles upon miles of trees, and only a few little log houses scattered far apart in the edge of the big woods. So as far as the little girl could see, there was only the one little house where she lived with her father and mother, her sister Mary, and her baby sister Carrie. A wagon track ran before the house because they didn't have roads back then. They didn't have interstates and pavement and things. So this is just a pair of tracks where a wagon would roll. A wagon track ran before the house, turning and twisting out of sight in the woods where the wild animals lived. But the little girl did not know where it went, nor what might be at the end of it. The little girl was named Laura, and she called her father Pa and her mother Ma. In those days and in that place, children did not say father and mother, nor mama and papa, or in my case, I said mommy and daddy when I was growing up. At night, when Laura, hi there. So this is our sleepy cat. His name is Cooper. That's what this channel is named after. And he sometimes likes to come read books to you as well. So I just had to introduce him. At night, when Laura lay awake in the trundle bed, a trundle bed is like a little bed that slides up underneath the grown-up's bed because they couldn't afford two beds for everyone to sleep on. When Laura lay awake in the trundle bed, she listened and could not hear anything at all but the sound of the trees whispering together. Sometimes, far away in the night, a wolf howled, "Ow!" Then he came nearer and howled again, "Ow!" It was a scary sound. Laura knew that wolves would eat little girls, yum, 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 yum. But she was safe inside the solid log walls. Her father's gun hung over the door, and good old Jack, the brindle bulldog, lay on guard before it. This word here, brindle, it means kind of tiger stripy. So Jack is a bulldog who's got stripes all over him. Laura's father would say, "Go to sleep, Laura. Jack won't let the wolves in." So Laura snuggled under the covers of the trundle bed, close beside Mary, and went to sleep. One night, her father picked her up out of the bed and carried her to the window so that she could see the wolves. There were two of them, standing or sitting in front of the house. They looked like shaggy dogs. They pointed their noses at the big bright moon and howled, "Ow!" Jack paced up and down before the door, growling, "Urr, urr, urr." The hair stood up on his back, and he showed his sharp, fierce teeth to the wolves. They howled, "Ow!" but they couldn't get in. The house was a comfortable house. Upstairs, there was a large attic, pleasant to play in when the rain drummed on the roof. Downstairs was a small bedroom and the big room. The bedroom had a window that closed with a wooden shutter. The big room had two windows with glass in the panes, kind of like we have now, and it had two doors, a front door and a back door. All around the house was a crooked rail fence to keep the bears and the deer away. When it says rail, it doesn't mean rail like a train track or like a railroad. It's talking about a way that they chopped up the trees so they could make them into a fence. So this is a fence made out of trees. In the yard in front of the house were two beautiful big oak trees. Every morning, as soon as she was awake, Laura ran to look out of the window. And one morning, she saw in each of the big trees a dead deer hanging from a branch. Pa had shot the deer the day before, and Laura had been asleep when he brought them home at night and hung them high in the trees so the wolves would not eat the meat. That day, Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary had fresh venison for dinner. Venison is another word for deer meat, so they got to eat the deer for dinner. It was so good that Laura wished that they could eat it all. But most of the meat must be salted and smoked and packed away to be eaten in the winter. Since this was such a long time ago, 150 years, they didn't have electricity. They didn't have grocery stores like Kroger or Publix. They didn't have Walmarts. And they also didn't have refrigerators to keep their food cold. So they had to grow and kill all their food, and they had to prepare it in a way that would keep it safe so they wouldn't get sick when they ate it during the winter. Winter was coming. The days were shorter, and frost crawled up the window panes at night. Soon the snow would come. Then the log house would be almost buried in snowdrifts, and the lake and the streams would freeze. In the bitter cold weather, Pa could not be sure of finding any wild game to shoot for meat. Game is another word for wild creatures like deer and bears. So Pa could not be sure of finding any wild animals to shoot for meat. The bears would be hidden away in their dens where they slept soundly all winter long, all cuddled up. The squirrels would be curled up in their nests in the hollow trees with their furry tails wrapped around their noses. Even if Pa could get a deer, it would be poor and thin, not fat and plump as deer are in the fall. Pa might hunt alone all day in the bitter cold, in the big woods covered in snow, and come home at night with nothing for Ma and Mary and Laura to eat. So, as much food as possible must be stored away in the little house before winter came. Pa skinned the deer carefully and salted and stretched the hides, for he would make soft leather of them. Then he cut up the meat and sprinkled salt over the pieces as he laid them on a board. Standing on end in the yard was a tall length cut from the trunk of a big hollow tree. Pa had driven nails inside as far as he could reach from each end. Then he stood it up, put a little roof on the top, and cut a little door on one side near the bottom. On the piece that he cut out, he fastened leather hinges. A hinge is the part that lets a door open like this. Then he fitted it into place, and that was the little door with the bark still on it. After the deer meat had been salted several days, Pa cut a hole near the end of each piece and put a string through it, like you might if you were sewing something. Laura watched him do this, and then she watched him hang the meat on the nails up in the hollow log. We're going to see a picture of what this looked like in the next couple pages. He reached up through the little door and hung meat on the nails as far up as he could reach. Then he put a ladder against the log, climbed to the top, moved the roof to one side, and reached down inside to hang meat on those nails. Then Pa put the roof back again, climbed down the ladder, and said to Laura, "Run over to the chopping block and fetch me some of those green hickory chips, new clean white ones." So when we're talking about a tree or a plant being green, what we mean is that it's still alive and it hasn't dried out yet, because things burn better in fires when they dry out. So Laura ran to the block where Pa chopped wood and filled her apron with the fresh, sweet-smelling chips. Just inside the little door and the hollow log, Pa built a fire of tiny bits of bark and moss, and he laid some of the chips on it very carefully. Instead of burning quickly, the green chips smoldered and filled the hollow log with a thick, choking smoke. Pa shut the door, and a little smoke squeezed through the crack around it, and a little smoke came out through the roof, but most of it was shut in with the meat. "There's nothing better than good hickory smoke," Pa said. "That will make good venison that will keep anywhere in any weather." Then he took his gun and, putting his axe on his shoulder, he went away to the clearing to cut down some more trees. Laura and Ma watched the fire for several days. When smoke stopped coming through the cracks, Laura would bring more hickory chips, and Ma would put them on the fire under the meat. All the time, there was a little smell of smoke in the yard, and when the door was opened, a thick, smoky, meaty smell came out. So here's a picture I mentioned. We've got our little tree house right here that Pa built with the little roof, and this is Ma putting more hickory chips on the fire, and this is little Laura picking up more chips to bring to Ma. At last, Pa said the venison had smoked long enough. Then they let the fire go out, and Pa took all the strips and pieces of meat out of the hollow tree. Ma wrapped each piece neatly in paper and hung them up in the attic where they would keep safe and dry. One morning, Pa went away before daylight with the horses and the wagon, and that night he came home with a wagon load of fish. The big wagon box was piled full to the top, and some of those fish were as big as Laura. Can you imagine a fish as big as you? That would be a lot of food that they could eat. Pa had gone to Lake Pepin and caught them all with a net. Ma cut large slices of flaky white fish without one bone for Laura and Mary. They all feasted, yum, 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 on the good fresh fish. All they did not eat fresh was salted down in barrels for the winter. Pa owned a pig. It ran wild in the big woods, living on acorns and nuts and roots. Now he caught it and put it in a pen made of logs to fatten. He would butcher it as soon as the weather was cold enough to keep the pork frozen. Once in the middle of the night, Laura woke up and she heard the pig squealing, wee, wee, wee. Pa jumped out of bed, snatched his gun from the wall, and ran outdoors. Then Laura heard the gun go off once, twice. Boom, boom. When Pa came back, he told what had happened. He had seen a big black bear standing beside the pig pen. The bear was reaching down in the pen to try to grab the pig, and the pig was running and squealing, "Ree, ree!" Pa saw this in the starlight, because remember, he didn't have a flashlight because this was a long time ago. Pa saw this in the starlight and he fired quickly, but the light was dim, so he couldn't really see. And in his haste, which is another word for hurry, so in his haste, in his hurry, he missed the bear. The bear ran away into the woods, not hurt at all. Laura was sorry that Pa did not get the bear. She liked bear meat so much. Pa was sorry too, but he said, "Anyway, I saved the bacon." The garden behind the little house had been growing all summer. It was so near the house that the deer did not jump over the fence and eat the vegetables in the daytime. And at night, Jack, that's our brindle bulldog, at night Jack kept them away. Sometimes in the morning, there were little hoof prints among the carrots and the cabbages, but Jack's paw prints were there too, and the deer had jumped right out again. Now the potatoes and carrots, the beets and turnips and cabbages were gathered and stored in the cellar, for freezing nights had come. A cellar is kind of like a basement below your house where everything stays kind of cold, around 50 degrees all year long. And since they didn't have refrigerators, they would dig these cellars to put their vegetables in so the vegetables would stay fresh. Onions were made into long ropes, braided together by their tops, because onions, they aren't just the little circle part, they're the plant part that grows above the ground. So that's what they're braiding together. And then they were hung in the attic beside wreaths of red peppers strung up on threads. That's with a needle and thread. The pumpkins and the squashes were piled in orange and yellow and green heaps in the attic's corners. The barrels of salted fish were in the pantry, and yellow cheeses were stacked on the pantry shelves. Then one day, Uncle Henry came riding out of the big woods. He had come to help Pa butcher. Ma's big butcher knife was already sharpened, and Uncle Henry had brought Aunt Polly's butcher knife. Okay, so kiddos, we're about to talk about how they're going to butcher the pig. So it might be a little bit gross and a little bit sad, but I just want you to be ready to talk about it, because this was how people had to get their food back in the day 150 years ago. They couldn't just go to Kroger and buy hot dogs. They had to raise the pig and then kill it and then chop it up. So this is kind of a grown-up topic, but this is just how people lived life that long ago. Near the pig pen, Pa and Uncle Henry built a bonfire and heated a great kettle of water, like that's a big bowl of water over it. When the water was boiling, they went to kill the hog. A hog is another word for a pig. Then Laura ran and hit her head on the bed and stopped her ears with her fingers so she couldn't hear the hog squeal. "It doesn't hurt him, Laura," Pa said. "We do it so quickly." But she didn't want to hear him squeal, so she's got her fingers in her ears. In a minute, She took one finger cautiously out of an ear and listened. The hog had stopped squealing. After that, butchering time was great fun. It was such a busy day with so much to see and do. Uncle Henry and Pa were jolly. Jolly is another word for happy. So Uncle Henry and Pa were jolly and happy, and there would be spare ribs for dinner. And Pa had promised Laura and Mary the bladder and the pig's tail. So these are spare ribs like you might actually get at Kroger. As soon as the hog was dead, Pa and Uncle Henry lifted it up and down in the boiling water till it was well scalded. Then they laid it on a board and scraped it with their knives, and all the bristles came off. So pigs aren't furry like your dog or your cat might be, but they do kind of have like a beard with like whiskers on it, and hair doesn't taste good if you've accidentally ever gotten hair in your mouth. So they're scraping off the hair so it doesn't get in the food. After that, they hung the hog in a tree, took out the insides, and left it hanging to cool off. When it was cool, they took it down and then they cut it up. There were hams and shoulders and side meat and spare ribs and belly. Pork belly is actually what we call bacon. It's a big chunk of meat that they cut up into the little slices that are bacon. There was the heart and the liver and the tongue, and head to be made into head cheese, and the dishpan full of bits to be made into sausage. So it might sound a little bit gross to some of us talking about eating the heart and the liver and the tongue, but people had to eat everything that they grew back then because otherwise they might run out of food. And actually, talking about eating those organs, if you think it's gross, it's probably just because that was what you were taught growing up, because your family could buy other types of meat. In different places around the world today and in different cultures, some in the US, people still eat those because that's not something that they thought was gross growing up. And it's good food and it tastes good. It's just something that, since I didn't eat it growing up, I thought was a little bit gross, but really there's nothing gross about it. It's just another part of the animal. The meat was laid on a board in the back door shed, and every piece was sprinkled with salt. The hams and the shoulders were to be pickled in brine, for they would be smoked like the venison in the hollow log. Brine is another word for salt water, kind of like how you make pickles with cucumbers, except instead they're going to be making pickles out of the pig's meat. You can't beat that hickory cured ham, Pa said. He was blowing up the bladder. It made a little white balloon, and he tied the end tight with a string and gave it to Mary and Laura to play with. They could throw it into the air and spat it back and forth with their hands, kind of like a volleyball. Or it would bounce on the ground and they could kick it, kind of like a soccer ball. But even better fun than a balloon was the pig's tail. So we have a drawing right here. Mary is the little girl with the blonde hair and the blue dress, and Laura is the little girl with the brown hair and the pink dress. And they're playing with the pig bladder, which it sounds kind of gross, I know, but again, they didn't have a Walmart where they could go buy a soccer ball or a volleyball or a basketball, so they kind of had to make toys out of whatever they had on hand. We're talking about the pig's tail. Pa skinned it for them carefully, and into the large end he thrust a sharpened stick. This sounds like kind of how you would put marshmallows on a stick to cook them over the fire. Ma opened up the front of the cook stove and raked hot coals out into the iron hearth. Then Laura and Mary took turns holding the pig's tail over the coals. So it really is kind of like a marshmallow made out of meat. It sizzled and fried, and drops of fat dripped off it and blazed on the coals. Ma sprinkled it with salt. Their hands and their faces got really hot, and Laura burned her finger. Oh! But she was so excited that she did not care. Roasting the pig's tail was such fun that it was hard to play fair with her sister Mary and take turns. At last it was done. It was nicely browned all over, and how good it smelled. If you like how bacon smells, this probably smelled a lot like bacon. They carried it into the yard to cool it, and even before it was cool enough, they began tasting it, and they burned their tongues. They ate every little bit of meat off the bones, and then they gave the bones to Jack. And that was the end of the pig's tale. There wouldn't be another one till next year. Uncle Henry went home after dinner, and Pa went away to his work in the big woods. But for Laura and Mary and Ma, butchering time had only begun. There was a great deal for Ma to do, and Laura and Mary helped her. All that day and the next, Ma was trying out the lard in big iron pots on the cook stove. So trying out means melting down the lard, which is another word for fat, taking it from its solid form for where it was growing on the pig and melting it down into liquid. They use this to cook with, kind of like you might use oil to cook with now. And they also used it to make candles with, because they couldn't go to Kroger or Walmart and buy candles, and because they didn't have lights in their house. That was how they would be able to see at nighttime. So we were right down here. Laura and Mary carried wood and watched the fire carefully. It must be hot, but not too hot. Otherwise, the lard would burn. The big pots simmered and boiled, but they must not smoke. From time to time, Ma skimmed out the brown cracklings. Cracklings are kind of like pork rinds, if you've ever seen those at the gas station. They're a really good snack, and they're nice and crunchy and very salty. Ma put the cracklings in a cloth and squeezed out every bit of the lard, and she put the cracklings away. She would use them to flavor Johnny cake later. So I mentioned that this story is in Wisconsin. Well, I live in Georgia in the southern United States, and we make what we call pancakes for breakfast. This Johnny cake that Laura is talking about is a word that people up north use for pancakes. So Ma is going to use the cracklings to flavor pancakes later on. Cracklings were very good to eat, but Laura and Mary could only have a taste. They were too rich for little girls, Ma said. I think that Ma probably just wanted to save the cracklings for the grown-ups because they were so yummy. Ma scraped and cleaned the pig's head carefully, and then she boiled it till all the meat just fell off of the bones. She chopped the meat fine with her chopping knife in a wooden bowl, and she seasoned it with pepper and salt and spices. Then she mixed the pot liquor with it. Pot liquor is the liquid that was left in the pot after Ma boiled down the lard. So it's kind of like pig juice. She mixed the pot liquor with it and set it away in a pan to cool. When it was cool, it would cut in slices, and that was head cheese. So head cheese isn't really cheese, but it's kind of like Jell-O made out of meat, so it wouldn't be very sweet. The little pieces of meat, lean and fat, that had been cut off the large pieces, Ma chopped and chopped until it was all chopped fine. She seasoned it with salt and pepper and with dried sage leaves from the garden. Then she mixed it with her hands and turned it until it was well mixed, and she molded it into balls. She put the balls in a pan out in the shed where they would freeze and be good to eat all winter. That was a sausage. When butchering time was over, there were sausages and head cheese, the big jars of lard, the keg of white salt pork out in the shed, and in the attic hung the smoked hams and shoulders. The little house was fairly bursting with good food stored away for the long winter. The pantry and the shed and the cellar were full, and so was the attic. Laura and Mary must play in the house now, for it was cold outdoors, and the brown leaves were all falling from the trees. Sorry, my nose kind of itches. The fire in the cook stove never went out. At night, Pa banked it with ashes. That means he put ashes back inside the stove to kind of insulate the coals to keep them alive till morning. The attic was a lovely place to play. The large, round-colored pumpkins made beautiful chairs and tables. The red pumpkins and the red peppers and onions dangled overhead. The hams and venison hung in their paper wrappings, and all the bunches of dried herbs, the spicy herbs for cooking and the bitter herbs for medicine, because they didn't really have they had doctors, but they lived so far away from everyone that unless they were really, really sick, they had to make their own medicines. And actually, a lot of the medicines that we use nowadays are made out of plants, just kind of like these medicines were back in the day. They gave the place a dusty, spicy smell. Often the wind howled, "Ooh," with a cold and lonesome sound. But in the attic, Laura and Mary played house with the squashes and the pumpkins, and everything was snug and cozy. Mary was bigger than Laura because she was about 2 years older, and she had a rag doll named Nettie. Laura only had a corn cob wrapped in a handkerchief, but it was a good doll. It was named Susan. It wasn't Susan's fault that she was only a corn cob. Sometimes Mary let Laura hold Nettie, but she did it only when Susan wouldn't see, because Laura didn't want Susan to be jealous. So we talked about how they couldn't go buy their toys at Walmart and they had to make them themselves, like the pig bladder that they use like a basketball. So Laura made her doll out of a corn cob, which is what's left after you eat all the corn off of it. And she used her imagination to pretend that it was a doll. The best times of all were at night. After supper, Pa brought his traps in from the shed to grease them by the fire. He rubbed them bright and greased the hinges of the jaws and the springs of the pans with a feather dipped in bear's grease. So we talked about what they did with the pig grease and the pig lard and fat earlier, but when they caught and killed a bear, this is what they did with his grease. We have a picture right here that shows Pa and Laura, and Pa is putting the grease on the bear traps with a feather. There were small traps and middle-sized traps and great bear traps with teeth in their jaws that Pa said would break a man's leg if they shut onto it. It's kind of like a mouse trap where it goes snap, and sometimes it can catch your finger and it hurts a lot. While he greased the traps, Pa told Laura and Mary little jokes and stories, and afterwards he would play his fiddle like a fiddle is another word for a violin. I'm going to see if I can find some violin music to show y'all next week. The doors and the windows were tightly shut, and the cracks of the window frames were stuffed with cloth to keep out the cold. But Black Susan, the cat, came and went as she pleased, day and night, through the swinging door of the cat hole in the bottom of the front door. She always went very quickly so the door wouldn't catch her tail when it fell shut behind her. So some of you might have cats that live in your house, and you might have cat doors that let them go inside and outside if they want. So that's something that they had back then that we have now. One night, when Pa was greasing the traps, he watched Black Susan come in and he said, "There was once a man who had 2 cats, a big cat and a little cat." Laura and Mary ran to lean on his knees and hear the rest. "He had 2 cats," Pa repeated, "a big cat and a little cat. So he made a big cat hole in his door for the big cat. And then he made a little cat hole for the little cat." There, Pa stopped. "But why couldn't the little cat?" Mary began. "Because the big cat wouldn't let it," Laura interrupted. "Laura, that is very rude. You must never interrupt," said Pa. "But I see," he said, "that either one of you has more sense than the man who cut 2 cat holes in his door." So what Pa is talking about is that the little cat could have used the big cat's door, and then all of the heat in the house wouldn't have gone out as quickly because there would be 1 door instead of 2 doors for the cats. Then Pa laid away the traps, and he took his fiddle out of its box and began to play. This was the best time of all. That's the end of the first chapter of The Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I'm your reader, Miss Brianna, and I'll be reading you a chapter from this book every week on this channel. So like I said, my channel is called Sleepy Cat Stories, and I named it after my very sleepy cat named Cooper. He's sitting right here beside me. Can you see Cooper? And he likes to go to sleep whenever I'm reading stories. Thank you for watching my channel, and I look forward to telling you all about Laura's life in the future. Bye.